again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author, our good friend, Dr. Joseph Pearce. Further Up and Further In, Understanding Narnia, published by TAN Publishers. Available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Always great to see you here.
It's good to be back, Doug.
You know, in the same venue of talking about great English authors. I think you're probably more associated with most of our audience with Tolkien, though you did do those series on Shakespeare, the Catholic ideas of Shakespeare as well. So how'd you end up with Lewis?
Well, anybody who loves Tolkien loves Lewis because they were good friends. They were part of a literary group called the Inklings. They had a similar philosophy of creativity and obviously a similar Christianity. Obviously, Tolkien was a Catholic. Lewis was an Anglican, but he was a very orthodox Anglican. His work, Lewis's work, is just full of good, solid Christianity, and so I've loved him for a long while, and this was an excuse to go further up and further in myself.
Right, and you also quote from Walter Hooper, the editor of Lewis's Letters, premier Lewis scholar, who's a convert to Catholicism.
He is, yes. He was Lewis's personal secretary in the last months of Lewis's life, and then he was an Anglican priest, and then he became a Catholic. Yeah.
Right, and I asked him one time, well, what would you think he would think of your conversion? He said he would be very pleased.
Well, I'm not going to, heaven forbid I should contradict Walter Hooper.
That's right, exactly. So I thought that was an interesting way of thinking in terms of C.S. Lewis's kind of Anglo-Catholicism in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but he retained, I read another book called C.S. Lewis and the Catholic Church, and I looked at Lewis's attitude towards Catholicism. He retained certain knee-jerk Protestant attitudes towards the church, especially towards the Pope, the papacy, and towards the position of the Blessed Virgin. Never really overcame those prejudices.
Right. Okay, very good. So let's talk about this. Now, we're talking about Narnia, Further Up and Further In. How deep do you have to go? It's a kid's book. It's a series of kids' books.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty, it's not like Tolkien where there's deep meaning underneath the deep. It's kind of pretty obvious. There's Aslan. I guess he's a Christ figure. There's these other figures. It seems pretty obvious, no?
Well, up to a point, yes, in the sense that Lewis isn't as subtle as Tolkien. So such as Aslan being a figure of the Son of God, absolutely. But there's all sorts of other theological things going on in the 7 books that are not as obvious, and that's why I wanted to go further up and further in and to take people deeper, because the deeper you go into Narnia, the deeper you get into Christian theology and philosophy.
Now, you say in the beginning, you make the point that in the 50s, the book came out in order: The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, everybody probably the most well-known, Prince Caspian, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Silver Chair, The Horse and His Boy, The Magician's Nephew, and The Last Battle. The last several not as well known, even just for the fact that movies were not made of those particular stories, or even television shows that I'm aware of. But you say, actually, you number the books the way it happens chronologically in the time of Narnia. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, it's the question you have to ask yourself before you embark upon reading the books. Do you read them in the order in which they were written by Lewis, or do you read them in the order of the story? I know that there are Lewis purists that will hate me for taking the line I took, but I thought it was important to read them in the order of the story. So you begin with The Magician's Nephew, which is the creation of Narnia, so God's creation of Narnia. You end with The Last Battle, which is the apocalypse. So it's Alpha and Omega. To me, it makes sense to do things in that order.
Well, why didn't Lewis write The Magician's Nephew first?
Well,
why did he wait to write it 5 years later? And do you think he already had it all sketched out that way, or is this something where he wrote these others and then decided, I need to write how this came to be?
Very much the latter, and that's why they're not written in the order of the story. I think that some of these were afterthoughts. So, to give you an example, I mean, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there's a Victorian lamppost in the middle of a Narnian wood. That doesn't make any sense, right? So Lewis has to go back in The Magician's Nephew and explain how it got there, right? So I think that yes, there is a case that some of these are afterthoughts and getting all to tie together neatly. So he wrote it in the order in which it came to him in his imagination, but the story, nonetheless, chronologically, when it's finished, it goes in one particular order.
Now, you yourself, in dealing with Tolkien, is the impression that Tolkien kind of thought Lewis's book was a little bit childish?
Yeah, I don't know about. Yeah, childish might be good. I think obvious. I think that he thought that the allegorical dimension of it, the applicability of it to Christianity was a little bit too obvious. Wasn't embedded enough. And he also thought there were certain ingredients in Narnia, such as Father Christmas turning up in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Well, if there's no Christ, right? If it's not a Christian world, right? Aslan is the Son of God, not Christ. Well, how can you have a Father Christmas? How can you celebrate Christmas, Christ Mass, the nativity of Jesus Christ, in a world where there is no Jesus Christ? So, so those sort of anomalies, I think, irritated Tolkien.
You say, unlike the Lord of the Rings, though, the 7 books that comprise the Chronicles of Narnia were written specifically for children. And then you go on and make the comment, surely they're just for kids, but that's tongue-in-cheek.
Yes, because the point is that all great children's literature speaks to all ages, because there's so much going on in them. The stories themselves are worth knowing, and then the lessons the stories teach are worth knowing, and then the theological and philosophical dimension embedded within the stories is worth knowing. So good children's literature is just worth reading over and over again.
And so critics who don't see it as deeply as you do, you refer to it having an arrogance of ignorance?
Yes.
Okay, and you're here to show them why they're wrong.
Well, precisely. I mean, I think to dismiss the depth, which Lewis was profound, had a profound understanding of Christianity, profound understanding of history, of literature, and the intertextual connection between literature and history. It's all in those books. If you don't see them, then there is an ignorance there, and if you refuse to see them, there's an arrogance there. Thus, the arrogance of ignorance.
Now, you say here, in other words, and to reiterate, fairy stories give us the moral framework necessary to see the world, and you're quoting Chesterton here.
Yeah.
Now, this is obviously Chesterton was gone by the time these were actually written. What was his interest in fairy stories?
Well, Chesterton, in his book Orthodoxy, which is arguably his most important book, there's a chapter called The Ethics of Elfland, where he talks about basically that the greatest lessons we can learn can be found in fairy stories. And this was actually hugely influential on both Tolkien and Lewis. So Tolkien and Lewis's philosophy of myth, which animates and motivates their creative process, is largely a fruit of Chesterton's philosophy.
Right. You say, in other words, adults need fairy stories even more than children. How so?
Because children have a natural sense of wonder, and one of the purposes of fairy stories is to rekindle in us that sense of wonder that's necessary to move to a level of contemplation. This goes right back to Thomas Aquinas. That humility opens your eyes of wonder. Wonder leads us to contemplation. It's contemplation that dilates the mind and soul into the fullness of the real. So that sense of wonder, that humility, is sort of, if you like, natural part of what it is to be a child. But that childlikeness, which is not childishness,
right? Which you make the point, the differentiation.
Exactly. Right. That childlikeness gets rubbed off many of us. We get old, we get tarnished, we get jaded, and we lose that sense of wonder. So we need to read good fairy stories to rekindle that sense of wonder.
Is that what happened to Susan at the end?
Exactly. Yes, right. Susan becomes grown up in a very childish sort of way.
Right. I thought Dorian Gray, as Oscar Wilde's cautionary novel, is childish.
Yes.
I never would think of Dorian Gray as being childish.
Yeah, basically, the difference between, our Lord says, unless we become like little children, we can't enter the kingdom of heaven. St. Paul says that when I was a child, I behaved as a child, but now I'm no longer a child. I don't behave like a child. In other words, that Christ tells us to be childlike, and St. Paul tells us not to be childish. So these are obviously two different things. And to be childish is to refuse the challenge of growing up. So Dorian Gray doesn't want to grow old. He doesn't want to have the fruits of wisdom.
Like the Peter Pan syndrome you talk about in the book, too.
Exactly. I mean, there is an element of the Peter Pan in Dorian Gray, right? He wants the picture to grow old while he stays young. Right. He refuses the challenge of growing up, growing old, and the wisdom that's supposed to come with that.
Okay. Now, you say that Lewis was in his second childhood when he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. How so?
Well, I think by this time we're in the late 1940s, so he is around 50 years old, and he decides he's written all this popular apologetics following his conversion. He's written 3 adult stories, in fact more than that, Great Divorce, several adult stories, and now he just decides that I'm going to actually do something I really enjoy, because he always enjoyed fairy stories. As a child, he invented a kingdom with talking animals. Well, now as an adult, as a middle-aged man, he's going to bring all of his depth of experience of life into the telling of children's stories.
Right. In a dedication of the book to his goddaughter Lucy Barfield, he wrote that someday you'll be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. And he talked about the idea to open the eyes to wonder.
Yes, exactly. And it's almost as if we lose the appetite for fairy stories, because Lewis also says, I think I quote that in the book, that when he was 10, he was ashamed of being seen to be reading fairy stories, because there's a period of adolescence where we want to be grown up, but of course that period of adolescence is not being a grown up, right? It's the transition, and if lots of childish things come with adolescence. So as a child, we see with innocence. That innocence sort of goes during adolescence, and we don't want to be dealing with the innocence. But then we have to rekindle that innocence when we get older, and that's what he's getting at there.
And you kind of poke at the people today with the idea of going from 60 to 17, right?
Exactly.
Millennial adolescence.
Exactly, yeah.
The baby boomers who never want to grow up.
Never want to grow up, exactly. They're still living, aging hippies.
And then you talk about in chapter 2, learning to read like a grown-up. You say the humility and innocence are not synonymous with mere naivete.
Precisely. And again, the first book I wrote as a Catholic was A Life of Chesterton, which was called Wisdom and Innocence. And the point about that was Chesterton wrote Father Brown's books, and one was called The Innocence of Father Brown, one was called The Wisdom of Father Brown. And of course the paradox is that they're not contradictory. In actual fact, to have true wisdom, you have to actually have a sense of innocence. You have to be shocked by things that are sinful. You have to be horrified by things that are sinful. You have to not want to wallow in the gutter. So that innocence is a necessary prerequisite for a deeper form of wisdom.
You say, let's begin with what prevents us from being able to see clearly, which is the brokenness of sin.
Exactly. I mean, pride closes our eyes. It goes right. Let's go right back to the garden. Basically, when we choose narcissism, when we choose ourselves instead of the other, we choose the challenge of love. It closes our eyes. It closes our heart. It closes our minds. We can no longer see.
Well, you also talk about natural degeneration. I don't know, do you paint fence posts on a regular basis to keep them from rotting?
Not as often as I should.
Okay. You say our vision is blurred by taking things for granted.
Yes, I mean, again, this is very Chesterton, it's very Tolkien, it's very Lewis, that we should be astonished by the miracle of the sunrise every day. I mean, that we are given a miracle every single morning, and most of us wake up bleary-eyed and think, oh my God, I've got to do it again, right?
Right.
So we're not seeing the miracle of creation through the eyes that we're meant to see it, which is through the eyes of the wondrous glory of God's presence, because that's what every day is.
Right. In our world, says Eustace in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. Even in your world, Ramadou replies, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of.
Exactly. I mean, again, if you can only see the material substance of things and not that deeper reality, you're not seeing reality at all. I sometimes say to my students, by the way, in what way are you larger than the sun and larger than the largest star? And that's because you can see the sun can't see you. You can write a sonnet about the sun can't write a sonnet about you. In other words, there's levels of perception, there's levels of greatness, levels of size, which go beyond the merely material substance of things.
Truly humble souls filled with gratitude and wonder do not waste time, they take it.
Yeah, again, another key component is that every day we're given time. You can't take time back again, right? So you can't make time, right? We're all, as Hopkins says, Gerard Manley Hopkins, we're all soft sift in an hourglass. In other words, our life is passing away like sand in an hourglass. You can't get it back. But what do you do with it as it passes? Do you waste it or do you take it? And to take time is to spend it in the presence of reality, which is in the presence of God. So in prayer, in praise, in poetry, in reading good literature, in reading good philosophy. In other words, in growing closer to truth.
To what the ultimate reality is.
Which is God.
Okay,
yeah,
you
exactly.
say another prerequisite for reading well is the understanding that a good story is not merely a diversion from reality, but a reversion to it.
Absolutely, and a voyage deeper into it.
Right. Now, you talk about here also the idea, the final thing we need to have in order to read like a grown-up is the ability to see the way in which truth is revealed in stories through the use of allegory or symbol.
Yeah, basically, that Christ himself shows us this. I mean, how does Christ teach his most powerful lessons? First of all, in his life story, in the story that he is, right? In the incarnation, his life, death, resurrection, ascension, founding of the church, history of the church, right? The history is itself a story, and there are lessons to be learned from that story. So other stories are stories within the story. And Christ himself does that, because the other way he teaches us is with parables. So he tells us a story, and we learn priceless lessons about reality from the story told.
You say Aslan reminds us of Christ, but he is not a personification or personified abstraction. What's the difference?
Well, because Aslan is the way that Lewis would put it is that he's not recreating our world. He's working on a supposal. Let's suppose that God makes other worlds. Let's suppose in those other worlds that the animals are also made in His image and are rational and can speak. In that world, how might the Son of God appear in a world of talking animals? He would appear as Aslan. So in other words, Aslan is the Son of God, so there is a parallel, there is an analogy. We are meant to make the connection between Aslan and Christ, but Aslan isn't just Christ pretending to be a lion.
Okay. Now, we go into the first book, in a sense, chronologically, in the sense of the stories of Narnia, though, was a later book, The Magician's Nephew. And this is set in right around the turn of the century, and we know this because of what?
Well, because it's a process that literary critics will tell you about called intertextuality, where you actually connect the text to other texts. So what Lewis does at the beginning there is talk about what else is happening. So Sherlock Holmes is living on Baker Street. So children's characters from other books are there. So this sets it, as we know, right at the turn of the 20th century.
Right, and also in here you talk about in The Magician's Nephew, without getting too deep into the story, the terror of atomic doom foreseen. Lewis, through the voice of Aslan, warns his readers that we, the sons and daughters of Adam, could follow in the fallen footsteps of Charn, who's a character, unless we abandon the path of pride and return to the path of peace. Yeah,
basically in The Magician's Nephew, there's a power of the deplorable word, which is actually the anti-logos. It's the absence of, it's the antithesis of the word that brings everything into being. It's the deplorable word that destroys everything. And of course, the analogy there is that Lewis is writing this in the late 1940s. So shortly after the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the midst of the Cold War, where atomic doom is a possibility, where at the push of a button we could literally destroy millions and millions of lives. So that's Aslan's warning. And again, if you like, that is Aslan speaking to the human children who are from our world, telling us that your world needs to listen to this because there are lessons to be learned here.
Right. Having not succumbed to the temptation to steal the apple from the garden, Aslan gives Diggory an apple to take with him for his mother, exemplifying the promise of Christ. Goes on to say that the children plant the core of the apple in the garden, and when the tree is full grown and blown over, Diggory, now a middle-aged university professor, uses the wood to build a wardrobe.
Yes.
So that's the connection.
Exactly. So a wonderful connection. Basically, it's a tree from the first day of creation, the tree of life, if you like,
right,
with the apples on it, and it's from that wood, from the apple, and the wood, the apple that goes in our world, that he makes the wardrobe.
And the Lion of Witch and Wardrobe is about 40 years later then.
Yes, exactly.
About 1940.
Well, exactly,
right?
Because they evacuated you in World War II, so
okay,
exactly 40 years later.
Right, in the autumn of 1940, about 40 after the adventures. And now there's Lucy finds her way in Narnia by way of the magic wardrobe. We discover that 40 years have elapsed, and we talk about the reign of the White Witch. Now you go into a little bit of a discussion of where the name Lucy came from. Now obviously he dedicated it to a Lucy, but there's also Lucia from obviously Fatima, and there's also Saint Lucy.
Yeah, the Saint Lucy, and of course there's the Latin.
Divine Comedy in Dante, you tie that into.
Precisely. So basically, first of all, the Latin word Lucy that comes from the name from lux, which means light. Saint Lucy is the patron saint of the blind, so she helps us to see. In the Divine Comedy, it is the Blessed Virgin sends Saint Lucy to send Beatrice to send Virgil to Dante. So basically Lucy's part of, and what's the purpose of the Divine Comedy? To allow Dante, who's blinded by sin, is lost in the dark wood of sin, to get him to be able to see the fullness of reality, ultimately of course in the beatific vision.
I was interested in the story, and a lot of people know the Lion of Witch and Wardrobe. The Turkish delight, you talk about the kind of like that being like a drug.
Exactly. I mean, and there's a drug in the sense we might not ordinarily think about heroin or something like that. That the queen knows in giving him this that he's going to want more because she's giving him something which is addictive. But of course, the drug is not just chemical drugs. That sin is itself a drug. Sin is itself addictive, and if we choose a life of sin, we become addicted to those habits. It becomes a habit.
It's interesting. You say Edmund, therefore, in this story, is the old Adam, the Adam who fails, whereas Diggory, from the Magician's Nephew, is the Adam who does not fail and the Adam who passes the test of virtue.
Exactly, because Diggory is tempted by the witch, who's obviously in the position of Satan, to take the apple for himself, right, not for others. And again, this is the big test. Do we behave selfishly or do we behave selflessly? And Diggory's tested and he passes because he decides to obey Aslan and do Aslan's will, and that means not doing what his selfish will is telling him would be good. Right. So he passes, where Edmund, basically through his own selfishness, betrays his own brothers and sisters.
Which reveals herself as a Satan figure, talks about the human creature's mind. You say the deep magic from the dawn of time is the rule of, I thought it's interesting, the rule of justice, the principle of an eye for an eye, but then of course there's something deeper than that, or something before that, right?
Well, Satan, so the White Witch, who's the satanic figure in the story, knows the deep magic from the dawn of time, which is justice. But there's a deeper magic from before the dawn of time. And what's before the dawn of time? The Godhead itself, right? The divinity itself. Well, within the divinity, there's no need for justice. The Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost are never going to act unjustly, right? So that's something that comes in with time, with free choice, freedom of the will, and our ability to abuse it. But the deeper magic from before the dawn of time is love, right? The giving of yourself completely to the others, as the Father does to the Son, and the Son does to the Spirit, etc., in the Trinity. So that's that deeper magic, which is love, which the White Witch knows nothing about, which is her undoing.
Right. When Aslan offers himself to the witch as a sacrificial victim, suffering in its place, he's drawing on the power even deeper than that. Just as the power of love and the mercy that flows from it, in the idea of someone who is not guilty offering themselves. As you say, in a Christ-like. What I thought was interesting in this story, too, is because you talk about Edmund and the prodigal son. I always think of, you think about Lucy a lot, and I guess you think about Edmund, but in a lot of ways, there's a lot of lessons related to Edmund, really, in this story. Yeah,
I mean, in many ways, if we're to be honest with ourselves, we have more in common with Edmund than we do with Lucy, right? I mean, Lucy's the one who does tend to do the right thing, and it's because of her faith and her humility that she sees more than we do. Whereas we're more likely, actually, to be like Edmund, that we're blinded by our own prejudices, blinded by our own bad habits, and we don't see as clearly as we should. So Edmund is, as well as being a Satan figure and the Adam who fails figure, is an everyman figure. He really does represent us in many ways, and we need that sacrifice of Christ.
Now, The Horse and His Boy is one. It's set in a different land near Narnia, but not Narnia, but also during the time that Peter and Susan and Lucy were reigning, right? And what was the whole idea of the talking horses and things like that? Why did he go there?
Well, it's a different. It sort of sticks out from the other six because it's not really about the children from our country. It's about children that were born in Narnia and the land of Calormen to the south. Right. Well, the talking horses, basically the beasts talk in Narnia, so that's not necessarily a surprise. They're rational beings. Right. But what is interesting is this is really an analogy that Calormen is Islam. There's a desert that separates this Arabic people from Narnia, but it's also an empire. So Calormen wants to swallow up Narnia. And again, for Lewis, who has an understanding of European history, this is like the Ottoman Empire.
Right, you talk about the Siege of Vienna, and Tours, etc.
Exactly, the Battle of Lepanto, and Battle of Tours, etc. We're talking about, from the Battle of Tours to the Siege of Vienna, we're talking about 1,000 years of this perennial struggle, which is not over. Right. So, Lewis...
Whether we like it or not.
Whether we like it or not, exactly. Right. So Lewis understands his history, and that there's an analogy, historical analogy.
So you don't think he was a racist?
No, he's a Christian.
Right.
A Christian can't be a racist.
Kind of a medieval approach. You also mentioned that you thought there was a connection, in a sense, to Carthage and his view of that.
Lewis was very influenced by Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man. And in The Everlasting Man, Chesterton talks about the worship of Baal. He talks about the worship of Moloch and the religion of Carthage, and the fact that the god of Carthage demanded human sacrifice, demanded the killing of babies, for instance. And basically it's the radical difference between a God of love who sacrifices himself for us and the god of, if you like, hatred that demands that we sacrifice our first fruits, including our own children, to him.
Jumping ahead to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, I thought that was interesting because you talk about Eustace's parents. For Lewis's generation, these characters signified that Eustace's parents were Fabian socialists, and more specifically, disciples of George Bernard Shaw.
Yeah, it's important. See, this is what people would not understand unless they understand the history of the time, that these clues that Lewis gives in the book, Lewis's readers, at least his adult readers, would know that this refers to Bernard Shaw and the Fabians, who were socialists. Bernard Shaw was a great believer in the Soviet Union. He supported Joseph Stalin. So all those clues are really showing that Eustace's problems, psychological problems, are a consequence of his completely screwed up parents, basically.
Right. And in the Silver Chair, Jill Pole is basically being bullied, and this is a condemnation of certain fashionable ideas of education.
Yes, where anarchy reigns, right? Where children just are allowed to express themselves, and if children are allowed to express themselves, right, the bullies will just bully the rest, and the rest live in misery, and that's the consequence of progressive education.
So in going through this time and time again, did you find anything new, insights that you gathered from looking at these?
Yeah, I think one good thing about reading great literature is every time you go back and read again, you discover new things and new insights, and that's why I should go back and read it again and could probably write another chapter. I mean, that's the beauty of good literature.
So would you recommend somebody reading the stories before they read this book?
Ideally, they should read the stories.
And then should they read them in the order that they were laid out in your book?
Yeah, I would read them in the order of the story. So begin with The Magician's Nephew and go through the 7 that way.
Okay, another book in the works, always, right?
Yeah, at the moment I'm working on a book called Literature, What Every Catholic Should Know.
Okay, well, very good. Well, next time you're passing through Narnia and Irondale, you can stop by and see us.
Thank you.
We can look for the pole right in the middle of the woods there. Okay, Joe Pearce. Further up and further in is the title, Understanding Narnia. It's very interesting. TAN publishes, available through our EWTN religious catalog, EWTNRC.com. There's always levels in all of these stories. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark. We'll see you then. Thanks.